Johnny Vega learned the sounds of New York from the underside up. City to him was not jazz in candlelit rooms or hit singles floating out of radios in yellow taxis. It was the whine of a bus braking at the corner, the slap of wet newspapers against a stoop at dawn, the way pipes clanged inside cold apartment walls. He carried those noises with him like pocket change and tried to trade them for music whenever he could. He was 22 in the summer of '76, broke enough to count quarters for coffee, stubborn enough to sing anyway. He rented a narrow room over a locksmith on 9th Avenue, where the window stuck in humid weather and the floor leaned toward the door. A twin mattress sat on milk crates. A second-hand cassette deck lived on the windowsill next to a jar of picks and a folded paper with chords he wanted to memorize. He worked afternoons at a loading dock on the west side, where crates smelled like salt and rope, and the men who lifted them smelled like cigarettes and old beer. The place had a stage that was more a platform and a microphone that hummed like a beehive. Ace, the bartender, knew his name and kept the light on the stage a shade kinder when Johnny played. Those were the nights when the street felt a little less heavy. He sang covers that paid for a burger, songs of his own that paid for nothing. He wrote them on scraps at the dock when the foreman was outside on a smoke break. And he wrote them in his head while he walked back to his room past the neon Chinese signs and the guy selling umbrellas from a cardboard box. His voice had a scar in the middle of it that made people look up even when they were not listening on purpose. It was not pretty. It was honest. The first time he noticed someone crying at the little platform while he sang about a man on a roof watching snow fall on the river, he forgot the next chord and had to start over. She dropped a 10 in the picture on the monitor and left before the applause. The landlord asked for rent with a face that had forgotten how to smile. Late fees added up like pebbles in a shoe. Johnny sold a watch that had been his father's and tried not to think about it afterward. He considered going back to Newark to work in the shop his cousin ran, straightening bent fenders. Every time he picked up the phone, his chest filled with the same tightness he got when the bar's stage light came on and the room waited for him. He stayed. A drummer named Manny started sitting in on Thursday nights. He had a loose way with brushes and a grin that said he had seen too many bad gigs to be bothered by another. A woman with short hair and quick hands played keys when she had no better place to be. Her name was Ruth, and she had a job arranging horns for a studio uptown where the coffee tasted like pennies. The three of them found a groove that fit Johnny's voice the way his old denim jacket fit his shoulders. Ruth told him he needed to record, said he had no money. She said she could get them 2 hours at night if they did not tell anyone and brought their own tape. The studio smelled of dust and electricity. Lights over the board glowed like a model city. The engineer was a thin man who moved carefully, the way people do around sleeping dogs. He asked Johnny to sing into a mic that cost more than every object in Johnny's room put together. They ran the songs live because there was no time to do it any other way. They recorded 4 takes of a tune about a boy with a radio pressed to his ear on a fire escape. They laid down a ballad about a woman who left her coat behind on a kitchen chair and a song with a chorus that felt like turning a corner and finding sun. Ruth mixed, while Johnny watched from a broken swivel chair, hands wrapped around a paper cup gone soft with heat. When the last fader slid down and the tape spun to a stop, the room held a silence that made his skin rise. He asked if it was good. The engineer said it sounded like the city, when it is honest. He took a copy for himself and did not offer to pay. Johnny did not ask. They pressed 100 cassettes with a cheap label that lifted at the edges. Manny knew a guy at a shop in the village who would put a few by the register on consignment. Johnny brought a stack to the basement bar and wrote the price on a piece of cardboard. People took them in 1s and 2s. The first night he sold 3, which felt like a miracle until he counted the money. Still, a miracle is a miracle even when small. A week later, Ruth called and told him a man with hair too perfect to be real had picked up a tape from the shop and left a card. The card had a logo that looked like a television test pattern and a number with an Uptown exchange. The office on Madison had carpet that swallowed, footsteps in a view that made taxis look like toys. The man with the perfect hair called himself a finder. He said the label he worked with looked for stories more than sounds. He said radio liked an underdog. He asked Johnny to sing a verse without accompaniment. Johnny did because he did not know what else to do, sang softly to keep the room from hearing his hunger. The finder smiled and slid a contract across the desk with a pen that wrote smoothly. Johnny read painfully through paragraphs about options and territories and advances in reversion. It was more than he had ever seen. He called Ruth from a payphone outside and put his forehead against the metal while the traffic rumbled around him. She told him not to let them own his songs forever. She told him to ask for a clause that gave him his masters back if they failed. To release the record by a date, she told him to demand a second single, if the first did anything at all. He walked back upstairs and repeated her words badly. The finder nodded like he had expected the dance. He made some notes and scratched out some lines and wrote new ones in a neat hand. Johnny's heart pounded so hard he could feel it in his teeth. The studio they used for the album had a bigger board, thicker curtains, and a refrigerator that hummed like a content animal. A man with a reputation produced. He wore shirts that buttoned too low and had a laugh that made assistants stand straighter. He told Johnny that his voice would be the reason people stopped what they were doing to listen. He also told him that singers were like high windows. They let light in. They did not always understand how the room got built. Johnny nodded because he needed everyone in the room and had no power to argue. Ruth arranged strings for 2 tracks and kept her eyes cool. Manny played on 3 songs and then watched a session player with smoother elbows take his seat for the rest. The producer said it was about polish. Manny shook Johnny's hand in the hallway and said, "Make them remember your name anyway." The single they chose first was the chorus that felt like turning a corner and finding sun. A station in Connecticut played it at midnight. A station in Jersey played it at 10 in the morning when commuters were stuck on the turnpike. A station in Queens played it 6 times in one weekend because the night guy liked the way the drums sank just behind the beat. The label sent a box of copies to small stations with handwritten notes and $100 tucked in. A larger station in the city added it after a promotion man took a program director for a very late steak dinner. By the 3rd week of release, Johnny heard his own voice coming out of a taxi one afternoon while he waited for a light to change. He stood in the crosswalk and forgot to walk. A man behind him shouted, and then saw Johnny's face and did not shout again. The first tour was small. He opened for a band with a hit that was already fading. He learned to sleep on buses that shook like bridges in a storm. He learned to smile at a sound man who did not remember his name from the afternoon. He learned to accept that the hotel would always smell like furniture polish, and that every dressing room would be colder than the hallway. He also learned that a room of strangers could breathe with him when he held a note longer than usual, and that a crowd would wait for the first word with a hunger that could lift him clear, off the floor if he let it. After the shows, he signed shirts that were not his, and records he did not own, and napkins that would brown in a week. He wrote his name carefully like each syllable mattered in Milwaukee. A woman in a coat lined with cheap fur pressed a folded paper into his hand and asked him to sing it someday. It was a poem about a girl at a bus stop counting the cracks in the sidewalk to keep from crying. He put the paper in his jacket pocket and felt it every time he moved. In Cleveland, a man told him that the song about the kitchen chair had saved his marriage and then burst into tears. In Hartford, someone shouted that Johnny had stolen a melody from a band no one else had heard of. The shout turned into a shove and security moved. Afterward, Johnny sat on a milk crate and stared at the floor until his tour manager told him he had 10 minutes. He stood up and sang like his life depended on it, which it did. The second single hovered in the top 24 6 weeks and then walked up the chart, as if it had remembered something important. He went home to New York and found that his street had changed overnight. The locksmith downstairs shook his hand and refused 1 month's rent. The diner at the corner poured his coffee without asking and slipped him a piece of pie he had not ordered. People looked at him differently on the sidewalk. Some smiled and some watched without expression, as if waiting to see whether he would float or sink. Ruth hugged him and told him to buy decent shoes. Johnny could talk to the label about letting him play more dates. Johnny said he would try. He tried. The label said the band had already been fixed. He bought Manny an amp with his own money and left it backstage at a club with a note. Fame arrived not as a parade, but as a draft under the door. He noticed it first when an old friend from the Doc asked for tickets with a tone that held accusation, as if the tickets were the proof that Johnny remembered who he had been. He noticed it in the way promoters used his last name like a lever. He noticed it in the photographers who smelled like cloves and stood closer than felt comfortable, looking for a kind of truth that would sell magazines. He noticed it in himself. Most of all, in the way he could not walk through his neighborhood without feeling watched. In the way he stopped singing to himself on the sidewalk because someone might hear him and decide to listen forever. The second record was faster to make and harder to live with. The label wanted what had worked and also wanted it to sound new. The producer was out of the country and a different man took his place. Someone who liked bright snares and hand claps, and a kind of cheer that felt thin to Johnny's ear. He wrote at night, while the city flipped its signs from open to closed. He tried to find the ache he had used like a tuning fork on the first album, and found that ache had become an echo of itself. He worried that his hunger had been recorded and sold and now sat on strangers' shelves. He wondered what was left behind for him to use. He started sleeping badly in hotel rooms. It all had the same art above the bed. He sat at windows and watched lights go off floor by floor across from him, and felt a quiet panic rise for no good reason at all. He drank to get the panic down, did not drink more than anyone else around him, and that made it worse because he could not blame the panic on excess. He thought maybe it was the rooms. He thought maybe it was being looked at like an object that carried a sound. He thought maybe it was the fact that for the first time since he had come to the city, he could buy anything he wanted other than what he needed most, which was peace. Interviews began to replace afternoons. He learned to tell the story of sleeping over the locksmith in sentences that fit a 4-minute radio segment. He learned to smile when a man with large glasses asked whether his voice had come from heartbreak, or whether heartbreak had come from his voice. He learned to dodge questions about the producer who had vanished and about women who stood at the side of the stage in small towns. He learned to answer questions about politics with a vague compassion that angered no one and satisfied no one either. He learned to talk and felt himself grow thinner with each answer. He could still sing. When the band started the tune about the boy on the fire escape, he could still feel the crackle from the back row to the stage. When the room waited for the first word of the ballad, he could still hear silence become a kind of music. Those moments saved him in winter and in deserts of summer and in airports that smelled like burned coffee. They reminded him that he had made a sound that mattered. It did not fix the part of him that woke at 4 a.m. with his heart going hard, and his thoughts running as if chased. He started taking long walks alone in cities where he knew he would not be bothered. In Toronto, he walked by the lake until the wind pushed tears from his eyes. In Portland, he walked through a neighborhood of old houses and counted porch lights, telling himself he would feel better when he got to 50. In London, he walked in the rain with his hood up and listened to tires hiss and thought he could live there because the rain hit everyone equally. He kept thinking about the boy with the radio pressed to his ear and wondered what became of him when the song ended. The third single hit #1, the week his mother died. He stood in a narrow church in Newark and listened to a priest talk about mercy and felt the summer heat press against his suit jacket. His sister squeezed his hand and told him he had made their mother proud. He rode back to the city in a car that smelled like lemon and leather and asked the driver to take the long way. He watched teenagers hang from a hydrant and a man push a cart of ice, and a woman on a stoop read a letter with a mouth that moved. The city looked exactly the same as it had when he was broke. He also knew every face on the block would turn if he stepped out and that their eyes would connect him to someone they thought they knew. He went home to the locksmith building because he could not imagine sleeping anywhere else that night. The door still stuck in humid weather. The floor still leaned. The cassette deck on the windowsill was gone because he had given it to a kid in the neighborhood when the first album went gold. He sat on the mattress and listened to the old pipes and felt a kind of peace move through him. He walked to the corner where the diner poured coffee and the woman behind the counter called him honey and put a plate in front of him without asking. When he left, he put too much money on the table and she followed him to the door to give half back. He stood on the sidewalk and watched the street wake and felt the old draft under the door of his life and told himself he could choose whether to let it in. He could not slow the work. Momentum was a creature that needed feeding. The label built a bigger tour. The band grew and shrank as players came and went. The trucks carried more lights. The hotels improved and somehow grew less comfortable. His face appeared on a giant board in Times Square, and he crossed the street with his collar up and pretended not to see it. A company asked him to hold a can of soda and a photograph. The money they offered made his agent whistle. He said no, and then said yes, and then said no again, and finally said nothing long enough that the company went away and offered the job to someone else. He wrote in hotel notebooks with logos on the cover and left most of them in drawers. Night after night, he sang as if the sound could hold his life together, and most nights it worked. The crowd lifted him. The crowd pushed him. The crowd expected a piece of him to take home, and he gave it, and woke the next day feeling like a shirt someone had borrowed and not returned. He started to wonder what would happen if he did not go on stage one night. He pictured the room waiting, and the promoter on a phone, and the announcement in the lobby. He pictured the way the crowd would turn back to the elevators with an anger that would boil into stories. He went on stage. He called Ruth in a city whose name he could not remember and told her he wanted to make a record with no single. He said he wanted to make something quiet, to give the label one more chorus that would make people remember how they felt in the summer of '78. When they first heard his voice in a car with the windows down, he said he was tired. She said she knew, and that he could come home and invent a life where no one watched him, but that he would miss the noise when it was gone. He hung up and stared at his hands and thought they looked older than his face. On a night in Phoenix, the panic came like a wave that refused to recede. He stood in the wings and tasted metal at the back of his throat. The lights looked like interrogation. The crowd sounded like a storm. He told his tour manager he could not do it. The manager looked at him as if he had misheard. Johnny said it again very quietly. The manager put a hand on his shoulder and said to breathe, and then said it was all right. And then said it was not all right at all, because the contracts would break and the promoter would sue and the crew would not get paid. Johnny nodded and stepped on stage and sang through tears he hid by tilting his head down at the microphone. Afterward, he lay on the floor of the dressing room and listened to the air conditioner roar and told himself he could leave tomorrow, and then told himself he could leave the next day, and then told himself he could leave in a week, and then did not leave at all. He bought his mother's house from his sister and fixed the roof, and walked the rooms and felt the way sound hung in corners. He put a small piano in the front room and told himself he would sit at it every morning when he was home. He did for a while. He wrote a melody that sounded like the click of a latch on a window in spring, and another that sounded like a match, lit in a dark kitchen. He did not finish either. People stopped by to take pictures from the sidewalk. He saw them through the curtains and felt like an exhibit at a museum. He waved one day, and the picture taker froze, and then waved back, and then lifted the camera again. Johnny lowered the curtain and felt a heat in his face that had nothing to do with weather. He started to understand that fame was not a thing he could hold or shape. It was a weather pattern. It arrived, it hovered, it broke, and it returned. With no regard for his calendar, the only control he had was where he stood while it passed. He could stand under it, could stand inside with the curtains drawn. He could step out with an umbrella and pretend the drops did not hit him. None of those choices changed the sky. He began to say no more often. Said no to late-night television, unless they would let him play without talking. Said no to photo shoots unless Ruth was there to make the room feel like work rather than spectacle. He said no to a second leg of the tour and watched his manager press his lips together hard. He said yes to a school down the block that wanted him to talk to the music class about songs. He went and told them that melody was how you spoke to someone without their permission, and that lyrics were how you kept the person listening after they realized you were speaking. He told them to listen to their streets and their rooms. He told them to write more than they showed and to throw away more than they recorded. He told them the truth he had learned on the way up, that the part of a song that makes a person cry is not the high note. It is the note before the high note when the singer decides to go there. He could feel the weather changing again when a new singer with a perfect smile caught fire, and every program director in 3 states played her single twice an hour.
Ow.
Label talked about pairing them for a song. He listened and nodded and did not answer. Watched the charts and felt no envy, only a lightness. The storm was moving away from him towards someone else. He could breathe. He finished a small record in a room that smelled like wood and coffee, and there were no hand claps on it and no singles. The label released it and then did not know what to do with it, and it sold the number of copies that disappoints. Executives and delight strangers quietly. Johnny played 2 nights at a theater near his old block, and the room was full, and the air felt like his own. He sang the hits because the people had brought them like old family photographs, and he sang the new songs that felt like entering a kitchen at dawn. He walked off stage with his heart steady and his hands calm. He went home on the late train, and the car was nearly empty. He watched his reflection in the window, and it did not look like the face on the record jacket in Times Square, or the face in the magazine that had asked about his diet, or the face the camera loved when he tilted it to the right. It looked like a man who had done hard work that left no dirt on his clothes. He smiled at himself without vanity, stepped off the train at a station that smelled like hot brakes and wet concrete, and walked through a quiet city that sounded exactly the way it had when he had first arrived. He unlocked his door and listened to the pipes and sat at the piano and played the melody that sounded like the click of a latch, and this time he finished it. If you want, I'll keep going with the next big block and take Johnny through the last turn of his arc, where he learns what staying human looks like when the crowd thins and the music stays.